Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2019 AWS Public Summit. My name is Peter Famighetti. At the back is LC Harrell. We are your room hosts today. Just a few housekeeping items for everybody. Emergency exits right at the back, the doors that you came in. If you exit to your left, my left rather, your right, coming out the main entrance. Bathrooms are located out the door on my right, your left, if you're sitting on that side of the room. And if you haven't done so already, if you wouldn't mind putting your devices on silent. For those of you that are new for the afternoon session, you can download the AWS Americas event app from your app store. Please don't forget to share your feedback on the session throughout the app. And all the sessions you can see on the day are going to be listed there. So for this session, I'd like to welcome to the stage, this is Mr. David Hill, Global Technologist from Veeam. We will turn the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you. Oh, paper's flying everywhere. There you go. So hello, everyone. As mentioned, I'm from Veeam Software, so I'm David Hill. I'm a global technologist in the product strategy group at Veeam Software. My focus at Veeam is around cloud-native technology, so protecting workloads running in public clouds like AWS, Kubernetes workloads, container workloads, that kind of thing. So quick question, how many people are Veeam customers? Oh, cool, I can go home. So for those who didn't put the hands up, I'm going to just give a little walkthrough around who Veeam is and what we do, and then we'll dive into the solutions. So Veeam was formed in 2008 as a virtual workload backup company. So when VMware first came, I would say kind of exploded into the marketplace from a virtualization perspective, Veeam was very unique, as in it was the first company to market that could actually directly back up virtual machines without agents running through VMware vSphere. Back in 2008 as well, Veeam had a lot of free tools. So this is how I came across Veeam back in those days, was they had things like free SCP, which was a tool that you could do secure copies to ESX hosts and things like that. So from an admin's perspective, they were really helpful and kind of provided us with a lot of cool tools. So we all fell in love with Veeam's free technology. You know, there's no better way to get people interested in the product than start giving away a load of free things. Moving on from there, around about 2012, Veeam not only protected vSphere workloads, but also Hyper-V, started moving into the physical kind of workloads as well. So when you think about physical servers into the data center. And then if you fast forward to 2018, 2019, Veeam has grown its product portfolio to essentially cover all workloads, whether you're running virtual, physical, or in the public cloud, we can now protect these workloads. So as of this year, Veeam became a $1 billion company. So from a software perspective, I think that puts us in something like 34, 35 companies around the world that as a software company has reached a $1 billion revenue. So from that perspective, it's very unique, especially when you think about just disaster recovery in general. It shows that the true value of Veeam's technology, that customers are prepared to buy into this, because from a disaster recovery perspective, it's quite unique in what we do, but the marketplace as well is quite unique. And while backups are nothing new, everybody's been told to back up stuff since the early days of IBMs and mainframes and everything. We've all done it. It's very unique to get to this kind of revenue growth for a software company. So what do we offer? Well, we have a number of capabilities that we can do from on-premises environments through to also public cloud environments. So quick show of hands, how many people have just pure AWS workloads, no physical data centers? Oh, that's good. So from that perspective, this is where Veeam offers some very unique solutions. So around the whole hybrid cloud model and what we can do there. So things like backing up AWS as well. So if you want application consistent aware backups, then today the way to do that is still through what I still consider old-fashioned way, but is very, very relevant still today, is through Veeam agents. Then when you start looking at snapshots and things within AWS, they're not application consistent aware, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also have the ability to provide cloud data retention capabilities as well, which is really important considering we're at a public sector conference as well. When you think about like compliance, you know, HIPAA is a great example as well for healthcare, but around government agencies as well, data retention is a really important one, and we'll talk about how we can build that out as well. So, quick question, how many people are using VMware Cloud on AWS? Okay, how many people are looking at VMware Cloud on AWS? Okay, a few of you, great. So one of the first things that we can do is, from a VMware perspective, VMware has been building out a whole extension of its software-defined data center built on AWS technology and AWS data centers. So for people who are leveraging vSphere environments, being able to leverage the agility and the scalability of AWS, but still using that VMware platform is quite important. So from a Veeam perspective, we've built out a lot of integration and extensions to help build this platform out and protect your workloads. So a lot of the key capabilities around this are very kind of expected features and capabilities for a software-defined data center. So very obvious one, backup and restore. But it's not just a case of taking those backups and then just restoring them to another host. It's things like being able to do instant VM recovery. And being able to do instant VM recovery across different platforms is critical when you're thinking about that agility piece. So from a kind of recovery time objective perspective, being able to replicate all your workloads across different data centers and across different clouds and different platforms is really critical to essentially getting critical services up and running. Everything's fully encrypted as well. So from a security perspective, everything that Veeam does, security and simplicity and reliability, although it sounds like a bit of a marketing term, is kind of at the forefront of what we're doing as a company. So how do we do it? Well, first of all, we have the VMware Cloud on AWS, and essentially you can deploy our Veeam backup and replication management console on that platform. And then we use things that are called the proxy service to actually replicate across the different platforms. So from an AWS perspective as well, we can leverage native AWS services to provide repositories and S3 object storage platforms to actually store that data in there. So when you want to replicate to VMware-based data centers, you can very easily just build out the VMware Cloud on AWS piece. It's as easy as it is in AWS native today. You log into VMware's public cloud console, essentially, say, spin me up a software-defined data center, and within a few minutes, you have all these ESXi hosts running in AWS's data centers. So when you already have your own data center, we have these proxy servers that essentially do the replication across either WAN links or internet links. As I mentioned, everything's fully encrypted as well. So all your replicas and your VMs, you can actually replicate across sites. Very simple. It's essentially the same platform, just in different data centers. So on the right, we have your own data center, and on the left, we have what we call the VMware Cloud on AWS, which is running in an AWS region. Also, when we want to replicate from your data center to a VMware Cloud on AWS data center, you can actually deploy, if we go back one, we can see that what we're doing here is, for the customers who are already using Veeam, you can deploy Veeam software on-prem, or you can actually deploy it out in the VMware Cloud on AWS. So it doesn't matter where we are. The good thing about Veeam is we're not hardware-based. So we're all software-based. So you can just deploy the software appliance in any location, whether it be in an AWS EC2 region, whether it's in VMware Cloud on AWS or in your own data center. You can deploy literally anywhere. You don't have to buy a lot of expensive hardware. So EC2 instances. As I mentioned, one of the key ways of delivering application-consistent aware backups is through our Veeam agents. So these are agents that are just deployed into the OS. Anyone not used a backup agent before? That's cool. So everyone knows what I'm talking about. So from that perspective, the capabilities that these agents offer is very similar to what you do on-prem today when you want application-aware backups. So they use things like Microsoft Windows VSS, so the volume shadow copy services. If you're doing things like SQL integration with Microsoft SQL Server, that kind of thing, they all tie into that. And that's the reason why we still use agents for this level of protection. From a CBT, so a change block tracker perspective as well, we can integrate directly into the OS and just look at the block changes in the underlying storage of what's changing and then replicate those out as well. So we're not just taking full copies of every instance that we're running. We have the Veeam Application Explorers. So you can see here an example. So when we call these the Veeam Application Explorers, what these actually do is when you take backups of all your services and all your infrastructure, you have things like Microsoft Active Directory, you know, Exchange as well. When you think about Office 365, we can back up all the mailboxes in Office 365 or Exchange on-prem. SharePoint, SQL Server, Oracle databases. These explorers allow you to dive into these backups without actually having to restore something. If we take Exchange for an example, you don't have to restore the whole database, mount that Exchange database on another server, and then dig through to go and pull out one email from Joe Bloggs. These explorers actually open the backups, and you can drill down and restore individual items from those backups. So same with Active Directory. You know, if you want to restore a user account or a computer account or something like that, you can actually drill down into these and restore directly from them. So it gives you a lot of granular control around how you actually do your backups and what you can build out and protect. Again, Linux, certainly in the enterprise, is starting to grow quite phenomenally, certainly with open source projects. Now, what we're finding as well is, from a Linux perspective, is in the past, a lot of Linux admins have been quite happy to script everything themselves. Now, with the adoption growing and becoming more mainstream, and when I say mainstream, I'm talking about kind of enterprise applications being run on Linux. In the past, in a lot of businesses, Linux has been used purely for development platforms, and then Windows has been deployed for your production services. Linux now is growing phenomenally from this perspective, and you're seeing a lot more kind of applications built directly on top of Linux and built directly for the cloud as well on these platforms. So the expectation is that the same capabilities for Linux as for Windows with our agents are being built out. So it integrates with all the expected kind of tools that everybody's been using for years, integrates with all the EC2 instances. So when you think about building out your infrastructure in the public cloud and in a hybrid cloud, Linux integration now is critical for networking components and everything that people have been building out with things like OpenVPN and all this kind of thing. So being able to integrate from that perspective with the same capabilities that people have been doing for the past 20 years with Windows is actually, although it sounds ridiculous, is quite new to Linux. So moving on to cloud data retention, what the goal is for this, and what now with the kind of invention of object storage platforms into, I would say, the mainstream IT environments, is being able to manage data at a lot less cost. So the challenge is around data growth as well. When you think about, if you go back 10 years ago, when everyone was buying storage arrays, and essentially the cloud didn't exist 10 years ago to what it is today, storage arrays were expensive. But for the storage admin, it was a case of, right, I'm going to go spend X million dollars on these storage arrays, and I need to plan for this amount of capacity growth over the next 5, 6 years, or whatever the life cycle of that particular hardware is. The problem is, data now has phenomenally grown just in general. If you think about 10 years ago, how many people had an iPhone versus how many people have an iPhone now, you know, I've probably taken 50 to 100 photos just personally in 2 or 3 days. You know, I have quite cute photos. I've got a little girl and she falls asleep on our boat quite a lot, so I'm always like taking photos. But if you think about that data growth, it's a major challenge. Just for me personally, backing up all our photos that me and my wife take is a big challenge for me, you know, and it becomes expensive for me as well, which is where kind of object storage comes in. And then, of course, there's compliance requirements. Well, I don't have any compliance requirements personally, apart from my wife, who would kill me if I lost all our baby photos. But essentially, this long-term data retention, you can't just store everything on a storage array. You know, buying a load of VNXs from EMC 10 years ago was your long-term data retention policy. It was, I'll put one here in this location, I'll put one there, and I'll replicate the data, and we'll just store it, and we'll use some off-site tapes for our critical data. It doesn't work like that anymore. There's too much data, and it's too expensive. So it's become quite a challenge. So what essentially does the market say? Well, a lot of the reports is around people want to reduce the hardware storage costs. You know, when you look at a lot of the acquisitions, you know, Dell paid a lot of money to buy EMC because hardware is expensive and there's a lot of cost to that, to the business that we're actually working in and developing. So when you look at these numbers, the fact that 66% of customers want to reduce their hardware costs, and then 47% of those believe that the cloud is the most effective backup media, is quite a unique shift in where we were even just 4 or 5 years ago. You know, when you think back to what a lot of the industry was doing around tape backups, 5 to 10 years ago, everyone was still using tape. You know, how many people are still using tape today for their backups? It's quite a few. And when you think about how that works, is you've got to take those tapes and take them off-site. You've got to have a man in a van turn up, and he essentially picks up a case of tapes and he drives off somewhere else. You know, that's expensive. Being able to offload that out to things like object storage helps you start lowering your storage costs. So when you look at Amazon's S3 platform, it's really cheap. Like, I have terabytes of data just for myself personally, and it costs me like 20, 30 bucks a month just on my Amex bill. So it's a real cheap option. It also allows you to start tiering your data. So you can actually start building in the management of this data to meet these compliance and retention periods. And the great thing is, it starts bringing in simplicity. From when you think about just managing that data overall, the biggest challenge to any business is the data management. You know, what have I got out here? What do I need to do with it, and how do I then look after it? And if you think about GDPR, is everyone familiar with GDPR? Yeah? Okay. Anyone from the European Union here? No? Good. I'm not oh, there is one. I'm not a fan of the European Union. But essentially, GDPR is the right to be forgotten. So the European Union brought out this rule that basically says anyone with any data about any person in the European Union, that person can ask for the right to be forgotten. Now, that's great, and from a personal privacy perspective, that's fantastic. But the challenge is, from an IT perspective, is if you've got a database with thousands and thousands and millions of customer details in there, And then I come along and say, hello, I'm David Hill, I live in the UK, and I would like my data to be forgotten. You're like, okay, no problem. You run a script against that database, and you remove me. And then 2 weeks later, you get a corruption in that database, and you need to restore from 3 weeks previous. Or when you do that restore, guess what? I'm back. Now I can sue you because you haven't forgotten me. So what Veeam does is, from a data management perspective, we can bring all this in, and we can actually start looking at these backups and as you're doing the restores and managing this data and say, right, okay, you've already got this list of details of these people that you want to forget. When we do these restores, let's make sure that when we do the restore, we strip all this data back out again. So from that data management perspective, this is where the cloud is really brings massive kind of benefits to it as well, being able to just leverage the cheap storage from a cloud data retention perspective, but also the compliance perspective. So from an architecture perspective, essentially what we have is what we call our scale-out backup repositories. So we have all our kind of network-attached storage, our dedupe appliances, all in our on-premises data centers. We have what we call our performance tier, where we store all our backups for very quick restores. And then we have things called the capacity tier, so Amazon S3 storage and also S3 compatible storage, so if you're running object storage on-prem. And essentially what we do is we take a VBK file, and a VBK is Veeam's proprietary backup file, and we take that and it's broken down into chunks. And we have metadata, and then we have all the different blocks of data. Now what we do is we take that metadata and we copy it out to our object storage platform. We then take the data chunks and we copy those out we move those out to our object storage platform. And then on-prem, literally all we keep is our metadata. So from a locality perspective, it's real easy to restore this data because it knows exactly where it is. It's out in the capacity tier. But from a consumption perspective, we've just shrank our on-prem backups. So all this data that we've moved out to object storage is now stored on really cheap storage, and all we're keeping on-prem is some metadata to help speed up the backup recovery process. So from a Veeam perspective, a lot of the capabilities we have is around what we do with that metadata. So the intelligent block recovery is essentially Veeam will look at where do you store all that data, whether it's on-prem, on the performance tier, in the capacity tier, out in the public cloud, and then it'll just pull it down from whatever's the closest point. So from a cost perspective as well, that's really good. If you've got like 100 days worth of backups in object storage, and then you've got 5 days on local, Veeam will look at this and say, right, okay, we've got what we need locally. We won't pull it down from our object storage platform because that'll save us on our egress charges, things like that. So it works out what's the best place to do the restores based on cost as well as speed and efficiency. Now, a key thing as well is around double charging. So a lot of vendors charge you to take these backups on-prem and store them off-premises in the public cloud. Veeam doesn't do that. So when you buy a license for Veeam, you get all the features and capabilities, and where you store your data is your choice. We don't want to charge you for any of that. It's your choice. We want to be flexible from that perspective. And then the key thing as well is around vendor lock-in. So recently we did some presentations at Cloud Field Day, and a colleague of mine, Michael Cade, actually referred to our VBKs as very similar to zip files in the 90s. So if you think about zip files in the 90s and early 2000s, if you created a zip file on Windows 95 or Windows 98, you can still open it today, whether you're running Windows 10, Mac OS, or Linux. It's still portable. It's still valid. So the data in it's probably kind of a bit irrelevant, but essentially that zip file never expires. You know, in 10 years, you will still be able to open that zip file. And that's exactly what Veeam has built with the VBK. We create this VBK, this Veeam backup file, and you can store it anywhere, and you can keep it anywhere. And if you decide that you don't want to use Veeam anymore, you can still open that VBK and extract that data even without Veeam software. So what we've built is essentially a platform that you can essentially use today to do all your backups, knowing that in the future, if you wanted to make the decision to go somewhere else, not that you would, you can still use those backup files and pull that. If you've got it in object storage, you can pull it down and still open them. So in 10, 15 years, you know that no matter, even if Veeam doesn't exist in 10 or 15 years, you can still leverage those backup files to do restores. And that's really, really important from a kind of vendor lock-in perspective. I know working with a lot of public sector clients over in Europe, there's a lot of concerns around vendor lock-in. You know, if you just go to one vendor and then you go out of business or something happens, how do we still protect our data and how do we still work with that? Well, that's what Veeam's kind of goal is. So, and you can even go and get like the free community edition and do restores directly to vSphere and stuff with our free version if you really wanted to at a later date. So this whole kind of no vendor lock-in piece is central to what we build as a product. So with that, I'm going to give you a 5-6 minute demo of essentially what we do. So hopefully this is going to work. So essentially, we start with our Veeam backup and replication. Currently, we're on version 9.5. And what you see here is we have a backup, and it's just a Windows backup. Now, we can do things like instant VM recovery, and you can see on the location that all our scale-out backup repositories, all our data is stored on a scale-out backup repository. So local backups repositories within our data center. And we're going to walk through how we can actually manage and configure these for the public cloud, how quick and easy it is. So you can see that just on a Windows backup here, we have a load of backup files, what you saw in that restore point. Now, if we go to our backup infrastructure, we can see that we have a load of Windows extents that we've created different backup storage. And these are just mounted as Windows drives. Now, when we want to add a backup repository, we have a number of options. And we're going to pick our object storage. And we have our S3 and our S3 compatible. Now, what we're going to select is we're just going to say S3. And we're just going to give it a name. So we'll give it add demo on there. And we'll pick some credentials. Now, I added my AWS credentials earlier, so we'll just pick them. But it's really easy. You pick your region. And then we can either have the VBR server directly on the internet, or we can use a gateway server, because most of the times you're not going to put a server on the internet. We pick our data center regions. We pick our S3 buckets. And we can even set as well things like limit and of consumption. So we're going to give it a folder name. We'll just call it Veeam Demo. And as I mentioned, we can limit the object storage consumption. So we can say, don't ever exceed this amount of data in this object storage. So we'll save that. And what it essentially does is it creates and connects to Amazon's S3 object storage platform. And we can see here in AWS, we have a bucket that we've called. And if we refresh that, we now see that we have a Veeam folder in there called Veeam Demo. But there's no objects there right now, because we've not exported anything. What we're going to do now is we'll go and we'll configure our backups to actually move automatically based on a particular time frame. So we'll go into our scale-out backup repositories. We have our performance tier, as I mentioned, which is our local backups. We can say placement policy. Do we want to keep it on performance or based on locality? And then we're going to specify our capacity tier. So we're going to say that we want to pick this object storage repository. And we can say how often or how old do we want these backups to be. We can also tell it to move all our backup files if our performance tiers become full. As of when we launch our version 10 this year, you'll be able to just say put all our backups directly in S3 without actually having them locally as well. So we've said that we've set that up, we've told it we want to move and what we want to do. Now, what we've done is we've configured essentially a schedule there, a policy to say that we want to configure and manage these. We can see that essentially what we've done is we've configured that object storage platform with our schedule. Now we say 4 hours later, but essentially what we've done now is all our backups are running, all our local files are stored, and we have our scale-out backup repository. And what we're doing is we're now tiering all those backups from our on-prem storage out to AWS's S3. So what we'll see here in a second is the throughput will start increasing and everything will just get copied out to S3. So it's really quick and it just does it all automatically. So you can see here that all the jobs are just moving along. Now all our backups that we took of that particular instance, we also now have, if we go back to our instant VM recovery, we can see that not only do we have them on our local repositories, we also have our object storage repositories. So what's really good from that perspective is when you think about our 3-2-1 rule as well, we can see here that our backups now, they're still the same, but our data's only 29 gig. And essentially what we did is we took 54 gigabytes worth of data and moved them out. And then the very final thing we can do, and I'm going to talk about this on some slides as well, is we can actually take our on-prem backups and we can restore these out to EC2. So we can do what we call direct restore to AWS EC2. Can we switch to the slides, please? So what we call that is essentially cloud mobility. So from the demo perspective, what I showed you is we had just over 54 gigs worth of data stored locally. We created our object storage environment. We said anything that's more than a day old, we want to automatically move that to the cloud tier. So it automatically, any backup you have more than a day old will just move out there, reducing our on-prem storage costs. And then what we also said was we want to be able to do restores directly from object storage. So what's really good about this is, from a mobility perspective, if you were to lose those on-premise storage arrays and you lost your on-prem backups, with it being out in object storage, not only can you restore from that object storage, but we can actually live stream from the object storage platform and do what we call instant VM recovery, which, as the name says, you can instantly restore VM and have it up and running. Now, there's some performance considerations around that, but essentially you, within a minute, can say, right, I've got these VMs in AWS's S3, I need these running on-prem on vSphere, and within a minute have them all up and running, and as the data's copying back on-prem, we're also streaming it from object storage. Now, Amazon will be really happy about the egress charges on that, but essentially, when you think about a disaster and all your data centers down, being able to live stream and get the services up and running with a performance hit is better than waiting for you to copy all this data across different regions. So from a cloud mobility perspective, and this is Veeam's very unique perspective on the data management. When I talked about the portability aspects, we have three capabilities: mobility to the cloud, data recovery, and test and dev. So 3 key use cases. Now, why is this important? Well, again, some numbers. So what the market says is 23% of backups expected to be in the cloud by 2020. PowerPoint's crashed. It says it's restarting. What you need is Veeam, because we can do instant laptop recovery as well. It's waiting. I can see loads of cool stuff on the screen here. I apologize. Can you get it back? It's all gone dark. Do you want to switch to my laptop, and I'll do it off that? Right. For the AWS people, the colors are a bit different because this is from the summit last week, so I apologize. But essentially, when you think about what we were building out, was 23% of backups are expected in the cloud by 2020. So interestingly, there's a big gap between what IT can deliver and what users are expecting. And the challenge we've faced over the past 10 years from a kind of IT versus user experience is the more people use an iPhone, the more they expect everything instantly. If you go back 10 years ago, if you wanted Microsoft Project on your desktop, you used to phone the help desk and ask them to raise a ticket. They'd go out and buy the software, and some multiple layers of people would approve the fact that you want a $200 piece of software. And then about 3 weeks later, something would pop up on your desktop and say, you're getting Microsoft Project. And you'd be like, yes, finally. The project's finished, but at least I've got the software. Now, with iPhones and iPads and all that kind of stuff, it's, I want Microsoft Project. Can I have Microsoft Project? To the IT department. Yeah, sure, it'll take about 3 weeks. No, it's okay. So then you go on the iPad, you launch your app store on your Mac or whatever, or Windows, and you say, I'll just have Microsoft Project. Oh, it's only $2 a month through Office 365. I'll pay that, and I'll expense that to my boss. So instantly, we have the software. And that's the biggest challenge that IT departments face now, is this instant kind of capability that everyone expects. Gone are the days of waiting. Everybody wants it now. And that's one of the big challenges we have, and this is where the cloud mobility piece comes in, is helping enterprises and businesses in general deliver these capabilities to the end users. So from a cloud mobility perspective, any backup, whether it's created on premises or out in AWS, can be restored to any platform. Any people using Nutanix in their data centers? Few people, okay. So we can do direct restores to AWS. We can do direct restores to vSphere, to physical, to Nutanix. We can even do AIX if you really want to do that. So we give these kind of capabilities around that. It's pretty much 2 steps to maintain the availability across all these environments. And the great thing is it allows people to unlock test and dev as well. So when you think about doing things like direct restores, a lot of people don't want to just restore directly to production. They want to test it first. They want to make sure that what they're restoring is right. When you think about back to GDPR, for example, you're not just going to throw everything into production before you've made sure that everything's stripped out. So you can do direct restore to AWS if you're running on-prem, spin everything up in the cloud, make sure it's all working, and then bring it back to your on-prem environment. So how do we do this? Well, restoring to EC2 is pretty easy. Whether you've done a vSphere backup or a Nutanix backup or whatever, we take those backups and we store them all on the Veeam repository. Then we simply use the Veeam Backup and Replication Direct Restore to AWS feature to essentially take that backup, strip it down, convert it from whatever platform it is to the platform it's going to run on, and then upload it to that environment. So when you look at some of the technical benefits, it's totally wizard-driven. Anybody remember the old days of doing physical to virtual conversions, like plate spin, stuff like that? Or am I just showing my age now? Well, when you think about essentially what you're doing is any platform, you've got a vSphere virtual machine, which uses a particular proprietary format of VMDKs and VMX files to make up this virtual machine. AWS aren't running vSphere in their data centers. They're running a different hypervisor, essentially on the back end of EC2. So the two don't talk to each other. So what Veeam do is we take these and we actually convert these on the fly. We can do things like UEFI to BIOS conversions, which is very unique. We just essentially take whatever virtual machine or instance it is and converts it to the other platform. So if you're going from Nutanix to EC2, physical to EC2, you know, nobody's going to actually compress physical disks and send them to Amazon and say, could you plug them in your servers? So we are doing this conversion on the fly and just being able to move them around. And that's very unique from a kind of marketplace perspective with this whole mobility, being able to move them back and forth. And when you also think about kind of what's happening in EC2, we talk a lot about what we call Veeam backup and replication for AWS. So I'm not allowed to give dates. So sometime this year, we will release Veeam backup and replication for AWS, which integrates with all the AWS APIs. So things like snapshots. You know, how many people have used an EC2 snapshot? Yeah, it's real easy, isn't it? Very similar to vSphere. You just say, I want a snapshot. The problem is a snapshot is not a backup. It's a point in time of that virtual machine. And if there's complications or certain issues trying to do restores across regions, it's very difficult to manage those snapshots. So with the VBR for AWS, you're going to be able to call these snapshots through Amazon's APIs and say, right, create this snapshot, go create however many days worth of backups through these snapshots. And then we'll take these snapshots, we'll convert them into what we call an OVBK, so our object storage Veeam backup file, and go and store them off in S3. You can then take those backups and bring them back on-prem. You can restore them to vSphere. So this whole cloud mobility piece, you can back up instances running in EC2, you can restore them to vSphere, you can restore them to physical, you can move them around wherever you want. So that whole data portability and mobility piece is very critical to what essentially businesses need now to be able to function. So with that, we have a lot of Veeam case studies that talk about how you can leverage Veeam for the cloud mobility piece, how you can leverage our data portability, how you can use on-prem and those kind of aspects. So if you go to that URL, you'll be able to watch a lot of the customer success. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm not called Rick Vanover. Obviously, PowerPoint's still having a bit of a fit down here, so I really appreciate your time, and we've got a few minutes left if you want to ask any questions. But thank you very much. Sorry? CDP. Yeah. So CDP is scheduled to come in version 10 some point this year. So I can't give you a date, but yeah. At VeeamON, we were talking about CDP and what we were going to integrate with that. So yeah, fairly soon. We're essentially working on getting the actual error recovery piece working. And from a Veeam perspective, there's no point releasing it until it's 100%. So, but it's coming soon. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry, can you? Oh, we have a mic. Sorry, say that again.
Is Veeam aware of different tiers like Glacier? Like,
yeah, so we don't support Glacier today, but Glacier support is coming soon. And then essentially when you saw what we were planning with the tiering, you'll be able to pick different levels of tiering as well. So when we were saying like move anything after 1 day to S3, what our goal is to say you can, when we release our version 10 product, you'll be able to say just store all our backups in S3, and then under that you'll be able to say after this amount of days move this off to Glacier and that kind of thing for longer archiving. Yeah, so coming soon. Cool. Any other questions? This man's ready to run. No? Cool. Thank you very much. Oh, we do have one.
We have one more question.
Hey, are you going to be able to do any like backup copy jobs to S3 for like a real 3-2-1 versus kind of
Yes,
tiering?
good question. So we can do backup copy jobs today. So with the capacity tier, you can actually just say, right, I want all my backups are here. I want to be able to pull them back on-prem just by setting up a backup copy job. The 3-2-1 rule is very kind of poignant for this. So the 3-2-1 rule, for anyone who's not familiar, is 3 copies of your data on 2 different media types with at least 1 location. And that's kind of a best practice for your backups. So with the object storage, you are able to meet the 3-2-1 rule by having your backups on-prem across your different performance tiers and capacity tiers, and then also moving it off to S3. And then if you want to bring it back on-prem to do whatever you want to do, you can just easily create a backup copy job and say, here's my data, bring it back to this particular capacity tier. So cool, good question.
One final question.
Yep.
Is there any benefit to using the Veeam proxy rather than the vSphere HCX connection for replicating the VMs across data centers?
Yeah, so from the VMware Cloud on AWS to vSphere, yeah, so the proxy just essentially creates a secure connection between the two. So it essentially encapsulates it all through, we leverage like an SSL-based technology, and then we just encapsulate that. So everything that you replicate, because essentially the replication is going out over the internet, is all encrypted. Now, if you have like, I forget what AWS call it, but essentially the direct connect link from your data center into theirs through to VMware, you don't necessarily have to use the proxies, but that's more of an architectural kind of consideration. So, cool. All right. With that, I'll say thank you very much, and I appreciate your patience with PowerPoint.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David. Please don't forget to download the app and share your feedback, and good luck for the rest of the conference.